Imagine this. It is the 1960s. A group of respected scientists sits around a conference table at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, sorting through studies on heart disease. Somewhere on that table is an agreement with the sugar industry and a payment that, by today's standards, would cover several years of a senior researcher's salary. Their assignment: make sugar look innocent and blame fat instead. How does an industry get to rewrite the science that shapes what an entire civilization eats? Now jump back 200 years. A cargo vessel moves slowly across the Atlantic. Below deck, human beings are packed into a space designed for maximum capacity, not for people. Millions of Africans are forced onto ships like this one in what historians call the largest coerced movement of people in recorded history. Most survivors will spend the rest of their lives cutting cane on plantations built for one purpose: to feed Europe's appetite for sugar. What kind of ingredient is so valuable that empires decide human lives are expendable to produce it? Different centuries, different continents, one white crystal connecting all of it. The spoonful you stir into your coffee helped build the wealth of the richest societies on Earth and fuel the most brutal labor system in the modern world. And when scientists finally started suspecting this same ingredient was killing people slowly from the inside, the industry did not change the product. It changed the story. This is sugar's secret history. From the cane fields of the Caribbean to the back rooms of Ivy League institutions. From the only successful slave revolution in modern history to the ingredient hiding in your breakfast right now. Before sugar became a symbol of power, it was just a plant. People were chewing on cane stalks long before anyone thought to refine what was inside them. The first domesticated sugarcane likely emerged in New Guinea and was carried westward by Austronesian seafarers across island Southeast Asia and into the Indian subcontinent. The story does not begin in Europe. It begins with people noticing that a wild grass could taste like sunlight if you cut it open. For most of human history, sweetness was rare. Your options were fruit, if the season was right, or honey, if you could reach the hive. That scarcity made sweetness feel almost sacred. Our brains are still wired to chase it, because for hundreds of thousands of years, sweetness meant energy, and energy meant survival. That is why sugar was never just a flavor. It was always a signal. When something rare tastes good, people do not just enjoy it, they organize around it. They trade for it, protect it, and eventually build entire systems to control it. The real turning point came when someone figured out how to trap sweetness in solid form. In India, around the 6th century BC, cane juice was being boiled, clarified, and crystallized into granulated sugar. That single process changed everything. Sweetness stopped being a perishable juice and became a commodity that could be stored, shipped, and sold across continents. That is the moment sugar stops being a plant and starts becoming power. Ancient Persian accounts describe it as a reed that produces honey without bees, a phrase that captures exactly the wonder it inspired in outsiders encountering it for the first time. Arab traders carried both the crop and the knowledge of refining it westward across the Islamic world and into the Mediterranean. The Sanskrit word shakara traveled the same route, becoming sukar in Arabic, zucchero in Italian, sucre in French, and sugar in English. The word itself is a map of the trade routes. For medieval Europe, sugar arrived wearing two masks at once. In the apothecary, it was medicine, dispensed in small quantities for fevers and stomach ailments. In the palace kitchen, it was theatre, sculpted into elaborate centerpieces for royal banquets, edible architecture designed purely to signal wealth. For centuries, only kings and the very rich ever tasted it. Everyone else had never touched it. That combination of desirability and scarcity is exactly what makes empires start thinking about supply chains. And supply chains are where everything gets dark. Europeans wanted sugar in quantities no local climate could provide. That demand pushed colonization across the Atlantic, where the Caribbean offered perfect growing conditions and land that colonial powers treated as theirs to take. Sugarcane arrived in the Caribbean in the late 15th century. Within decades, plantation colonies stretched across the tropical Americas. At first glance, it looks like agriculture. In practice, it became something closer to an industrial machine designed to extract maximum output at minimum cost, where the primary input was human suffering. Sugar is brutally labor-intensive. The cane must be planted, weeded, and harvested by hand. Once cut, it has to be processed within hours before it spoils. That tight cycle made it perfectly suited to a plantation system built on enslaved labor, where the goal was not efficiency, but extraction. And that is the real question underneath this entire story. If sugar requires that much human labor, who gets forced into providing it? The answer was millions of Africans, torn from their homes, packed onto ships and sold to plantation owners across the Caribbean and the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade was not an unfortunate side effect of sugar production. For much of the Caribbean, sugar was the primary reason the slave trade operated at the scale it did. If you want to understand the plantation system, start with sugar. Because sugar set the template, not just for what to grow, but for how to organize mass coercion. The reality inside a plantation was designed to destroy people. Days meant cane cutting under a burning sun with machetes and no shade. Nights meant the boiling houses, where enslaved workers stood for hours over open vats of scorching syrup in air thick with smoke and steam. The milling equipment was constantly running and constantly dangerous. Rollers crushed limbs. Boiling liquid burned anyone who stumbled. Overseers enforced pace with violence. Disease moved through the labor force like a tide. The death rate was so high that many plantations operated not as farms, but as machines that consumed human beings. In some colonies, plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to work an enslaved person to death and buy a replacement than to invest in their survival. The business model did not just tolerate this, it required it. That is the thing that is hardest to sit with. The cruelty was not incidental, it was structural. But the cruelty stayed invisible to the people consuming the product. By the 18th century, sugar had become embedded in European daily life through tea, coffee, chocolate, and pastry. The wealthy adopted it first, then the merchant class, then working people. As production scaled and prices dropped, sugar moved from prestige item to daily habit. And once a habit is established at population scale, the demand behind it becomes almost impossible to stop. The more Europeans consumed, the more plantations expanded. The more plantations expanded, the more people were forced across the ocean. This was not a cycle anyone designed deliberately. It was the logic of appetite meeting the logic of profit, and the result was a loop of consumption and violence that ran for over 3 centuries. That loop had an accelerant hiding inside the production process itself. When sugarcane is refined, it produces a thick, dark byproduct called molasses. For a long time, molasses was considered low-value waste. Then someone in the American colonies figured out it could be distilled into rum. What happened next is one of the most cynical economic mechanisms in history. Molasses was shipped from Caribbean plantations to distilleries in New England. There, it became rum. That rum was then loaded onto ships and sailed to the west coast of Africa, where it was used as currency to purchase enslaved people from African traders and warlords. Those people were then transported across the Atlantic to work on the same plantations that had produced the molasses that had become the rum that had paid for them. A waste product from sugar refining had become the financing mechanism for the entire slave trade. Think about the geometry of that for a moment. Every barrel of rum was a link in a chain that connected a Caribbean sugar mill to an African port to a plantation auction block. The triangle trade was not just a trade route, it was a perpetual motion machine powered by human misery, and sugar was the engine at the center of it. The colony that took this system to its most extreme conclusion was Saint-Domingue, on the western half of the island of Hispaniola. Today we call it Haiti. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue was producing roughly 40% of all the sugar consumed in Europe and more than half of its coffee. A single colony, roughly the size of Maryland, was generating more wealth for France than Britain was extracting from all of its North American territories combined. It was the most profitable piece of land on Earth. That productivity had a price paid entirely by someone else. The colony held approximately 500,000 enslaved people and fewer than 40,000 free inhabitants, a ratio of more than 10 to 1. By the 1780s, Saint-Domingue was importing around 40,000 newly enslaved Africans every year, not to grow the workforce, but simply to replace the ones who had died. The system was consuming people faster than ships could deliver them. The plantation owners understood exactly how precarious this arithmetic was. They responded with a system of terror so calculated and so public that it was intended not just to punish resistance, but to make resistance feel unthinkable. Public executions, mutilation used as spectacle, surveillance built into the architecture of daily life. It almost worked. On the night of August 14, 1791, in a forest clearing in the hills above the Plaine du Nord, enslaved people from plantations across the northern province gathered in secret. What took place was part ceremony, part military council, part spiritual covenant. The decision made that night would change the history of the world. Within days, the northern province was on fire. Plantations burned across a 50-mile corridor of the most productive agricultural land on Earth. The sky above Cap Français stayed orange for weeks. Sugar mills were destroyed. Overseers fled or were killed. The machinery of the most profitable colony on the planet ground to a halt almost overnight. What followed was 12 years of revolutionary war. France sent army after army. Spain and Britain both intervened, each hoping to seize the colony for themselves. Yellow fever tore through European troops who had no immunity to it. Toussaint Louverture emerged as a military and political leader of extraordinary skill, holding together a revolutionary coalition against three colonial powers simultaneously. Napoleon eventually sent his brother-in-law Charles Leclerc with an expeditionary force of over 20,000 soldiers and an order to restore slavery. Leclerc died of yellow fever. His army was defeated. The largest military operation Napoleon ever launched in the Western Hemisphere ended in collapse. On January 1, 1804, Haiti declared independence, the first black republic in the history of the world, the first and only nation born from a successful large-scale slave revolution. The response from slaveholding societies across the Atlantic was immediate and furious. If it could happen in Saint-Domingue, the most heavily fortified and intensively policed plantation colony on Earth, the logic of slavery everywhere was suddenly in question. The United States refused to recognize Haiti diplomatically for 58 years. France recognized it only after Haiti agreed to pay reparations for the financial losses suffered by former slaveholders, a debt so enormous it was not fully paid off until 1947. The people who had been enslaved were forced to pay for the privilege of their own freedom for over a century. Haiti is the part of this story that most history classes skip entirely. But it sits at the center of everything. It was sugar that made Saint-Domingue so valuable. It was the extremity of sugar's demands that made the conditions there so unbearable. And it was the unbearability of those conditions that made a revolution not just possible, but inevitable. Sugar created the wound. Haiti was the moment the wound fought back. But the story does not end with abolition. Sugar simply adapted. The adaptation came from an unexpected direction. In 1747, a Berlin chemist named Andreas Sigismund Marggraf demonstrated something that seemed almost impossible. The white crystalline sugar found in common beetroots was chemically identical to cane sugar, the same molecule, the same taste, grown in European soil, in a temperate climate, without colonies or tropical labor. For decades, the discovery sat largely dormant. Then Napoleon's navy found itself blockaded by the British, cutting off access to colonial sugar supplies. Beet sugar went from scientific curiosity to strategic necessity almost overnight. By the early 19th century, beet sugar refineries were operating across France, Prussia, and the German states. This pivot matters more than it might seem. The abolition of the slave trade and eventually slavery itself was driven by a combination of moral pressure, economic change, and the political shock of Haiti. But the replacement of cane sugar with beet sugar removed one of the central economic arguments for maintaining colonial plantation systems. You no longer needed the Caribbean to have sugar. You could grow it in a field in northern France. Sugar had survived the collapse of the system that built it by finding a new body to inhabit. And as sugar became cheaper and more abundant, it moved into everything. Industrial food production in the 19th and 20th centuries reorganized itself around sugar as a cheap, stable, universally appealing ingredient. It extended shelf life. It masked the flavor of lower quality components. It made food more palatable, more addictive, and more profitable. By the mid-20th century, sugar was no longer just a sweetener. It was an industrial input hidden inside products that did not taste sweet at all. At that point, a different kind of reckoning was overdue. Researchers had been accumulating evidence linking sugar consumption to heart disease, obesity, and metabolic illness for decades. By the early 1960s, two competing theories were circulating in nutrition science. One pointed to sugar, one pointed to saturated fat. The question of which one was correct would shape public health policy, dietary guidelines, and the food industry for the next half-century. The sugar industry understood what was at stake. Internal documents uncovered by researchers at the University of California and published in 2016 revealed that in the mid-1960s, the Sugar Research Foundation, the industry's main lobbying organization, secretly commissioned a literature review from researchers at Harvard University. The payment, equivalent to roughly $50,000 in today's money, bought a review that systematically minimized the evidence against sugar and emphasized the evidence against fat. The review was published in 1967 in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most influential medical journals in the world. It carried no disclosure of the industry funding. It was presented as independent science. It was not independent science. It was a purchased conclusion dressed in academic language. That review helped establish the framework that dominated nutrition policy for decades. Fat was the enemy, and sugar was not the problem. The low-fat era that followed transformed the food industry. Products reformulated to remove fat-added sugar to compensate for the lost flavor. Breakfast cereals, yogurts, salad dressings, snack bars, and hundreds of other products marketed as healthy or diet-friendly were loaded with sugar, while their fat content was prominently reduced on the label. The industry did not need people to love sugar. It just needed them to be afraid of something else. Researchers have since documented similar funding strategies across the food and beverage industry. Coca-Cola funded studies that attributed obesity to physical inactivity rather than sugar consumption. The soft drink industry sponsored research that downplayed links between sugary beverages and metabolic disease. The pattern identified in the Harvard papers was not an anomaly. It was a model, refined and repeated across decades and across companies. Find the scientists, fund the question, shape the answer. That method works because it does not require dishonesty from the scientists themselves. It works by selecting which questions get asked, which studies get funded, and which results get amplified. The scientists may be entirely sincere. The corruption happens at the level of what they are paid to investigate. So here is the full shape of what sugar has done. It began as a wild grass chewed for sweetness by people who had no idea what they were starting. It became a crystallized luxury available only to kings. It became the economic justification for the largest forced migration in human history. It created the conditions that produced the only successful slave revolution in the modern world. It rewired itself through European agriculture when the colonial model began to collapse. It infiltrated industrial food production so completely that it is now present in thousands of products that do not register as sweet. And when the science started closing in on it, the industry bought the science. That is not a series of coincidences. That is a single story about how a commodity becomes so embedded in an economic system that the system will do almost anything to protect it. The ships are gone, the plantations are gone. The Harvard papers from 1967 are now public record. But sugar is still in your bread. It is still in your pasta sauce. It is still in the sports drink marketed to your kids as hydration. It is still in the yogurt with the fruit on the bottom that the packaging describes as a healthy choice. It is listed on labels under more than 60 different names so that it does not appear too high in the ingredients. The method has simply become more sophisticated. Remember the ships. Remember Saint-Domingue. Remember the conference table and the manila folders and the agreement that was never disclosed. Because the history of sugar is not a history lesson, it is a user manual for how power protects itself across centuries, across continents, and all the way to the grocery store shelf you walked past this morning. Subscribe for more hidden histories like this one. I am Mr. Crevaz. This channel exists to find the stories that got buried.